shimmering lakes and vast forests, meandering rivers and green valleys all go to make up the breathtaking scenery that we experience when we explore the British countryside. Throughout the season there are plenty of pastimes that will give you the opportunity to take in the views and enjoy a well-earned break from the stresses and strains of 21st century life. However, if you crave a taste of the natural world without venturing too far from home, you'll find there's an array of delights, often no further afield than your own backyard. Birdwatching has been a popular way to while away the hours since Victorian times, when people first became interested in their feathered friends. Yet despite the fact that this was a hobby once reserved for the wealthy, today we are all able to indulge in this delightful activity. Observing the subtle differences between birds, studying their habits and helping endangered species to survive will all come with the territory. And whether you're a solitary bird watcher or share your interest with family and friends, there's a whole lifetime of pleasure awaiting you. And there's no better place to begin than by looking at everyday garden birds to get familiar with identifying species, while discovering that even the most common birds are as fascinating as they are beautiful. For the majority of us, when we think of everyday British birds, the blackbird and robin usually spring to mind. Nevertheless, there are many more species that are resident in this country all year round. From the lively green finches and siskins, through to the noisy nuthatch, there are plenty of beautiful birds that can be found in our gardens if we look closely enough. But before we start getting to grips with bird identification, here's a few useful hints and tips on how to make life a little easier by attracting as many species as possible to your garden. Birdwatching really doesn't have to be expensive, although as you progress you may want to buy specific products. You'll still get good results by simply scattering breadcrumbs or seeds though, bringing the birds flocking to feed. Household scraps, such as fat from cuts of meat, are also a tasty option for attracting hungry birds, as long as they're of an unsalted variety. Just make sure the fat is chopped finely so that a wider variety of birds can benefit, including the delightful smaller songbirds. There are plenty of other household foods you can put out, ranging from grated cheese and porridge oats to raisins and apples. And should you decide that birdwatching is for you, it won't be long before you'll be moving on to specialist feeders, which will encourage even more species into your garden. The birds will also appreciate your efforts if you plan your garden with them in mind. Having a perfectly trimmed, neat lawn may be a quintessential part of the traditional English garden, but you may want to think twice when pulling out those weeds and mowing the lawn within an inch of its life, as this won't necessarily encourage much wildlife. Birds like the pied wagtail, for example, tend to prefer plenty of weeds and will favour scruffier flower beds when it comes to choosing where they'd like to feed. Though generally birds prefer shorter grass, it's important to allow a few patches of grass to grow and flower, which will soon fill with seeds and insects, quickly encouraging a far more diverse range of species to come and visit. Most of us take great pride in our flower beds and vegetable plots, carefully cultivating blooms and tasty produce. But if you can manage not to use weed killers and artificial fertilizers, it'll be better for the birds. Chemicals can have an impact across the whole food chain, so be cautious with what you use on the garden, and where possible, opt for organic deterrents or fertilizers instead. In no time at all, you'll find you're much more popular with the local wildlife, and many more birds will be landing on your lawns and tables. Whatever the size or location of your garden, there are many methods and techniques to help you attract a variety of birds, ensuring that the bushes and trees are bustling with activity all year round. And as well as enjoying the view, you'll be rewarded with the knowledge that you're helping to protect species that might otherwise be falling into a decline. By providing food and shelter, you can give birds a much-needed safe haven, particularly as many modern farming techniques threaten much of their natural habitat, while urban areas encroach upon the countryside. Sadly, as a consequence, many birds once commonly seen, such as the starling and the house sparrow, have now been placed on the RSPB's endangered red list and are under serious threat as food supplies and nesting areas slowly disappear. Even species that are not in such a high-risk category will still benefit enormously from the little oasis of wilderness you can provide in the urban environment. So be sure to look out for rarer delights like the song thrush and the marsh tit. These are listed by the RSPB as having an amber status and are slowly recovering numbers. But generally speaking, when it comes to everyday garden birds, they are on the RSPB's green listing, meaning that they are not under any immediate threat. It's interesting to note that birdwatchers play a significant role in helping the RSPB monitor how species are faring, and keeping a diary of the species you see can be very useful indeed. Birdwatching is surprisingly addictive, and once you've got started, you'll soon find yourself putting up bird tables and nesting boxes, which will mean that throughout spring, summer, autumn and winter, all manner of birds will be visiting your feeding stations while you sit back and enjoy the flurry of activity. And as you start taking your birdwatching more seriously, you'll find that there are a few very useful items that you'll want to acquire. The first and perhaps foremost of these is a bird identification book. It's always a good idea to have one of these to hand, so you can easily and accurately record the different species you've seen. It'll also help you learn more about the variety of birds that visit your garden, as well as helping you spot the differences between them. This can be especially tricky, as the male and female of any given species can differ dramatically, while the types of birdsong, flight patterns and behavioural habits can give you lots of helpful clues. A notebook will also be vital so that you can jot down descriptions of what you've seen from day to day. To begin with, it's best to record a rough estimate of the size of the bird, along with any other traits you may have noticed. Beaks are always a good indication of bird species, as well as the more obvious plumage. If you hear a bird call, try and describe this in your notes, add sketches and resist the temptation to leave sightings to memory, because you'll want a detailed description for it to be of any value. It's worth the effort, and you'll soon find that the notes and drawings that fill your notebook will become invaluable when you go back to check on the species you've seen. Most birds tend to eat at the same time each day, so writing down when you spot a certain bird will also help if you want to see the same species again. You could also keep a note of what kind of food that particular bird favours, which will help when deciding what to put out in your feeders. As you begin to identify subtle differences between the various species, you may find it useful to invest in a pair of binoculars. This will give you a much clearer view of the birds that are visiting and make it easier to see the more delicate markings that are harder to distinguish with the naked eye. For example, the chaffinch reveals a flash of white under its wings when in flight, and if you look carefully, you'll find a yellow outer edge on the wing of a green finch. You can also identify various birds by the small differences between the size and shape of their beaks and tails. One bird that you'll certainly have no trouble identifying is the first of our everyday garden birds, the mischievous and often much maligned magpie. Magpies have black and white plumage and a very long tail, which they hold up proudly when walking or hopping along the ground. Look more closely and you'll also notice that there's a purplish blue sheen to the wings and a hint of glossy blue to the tail, revealing an altogether more exotic hue to this bird's plain black feathers. Traditionally, it's thought that catching sight of a magpie predicts the future, depending on how many are sighted, as the popular rhyme suggests. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy. If you're a believer in ancient folklore, you should greet the lone magpie to avoid bad luck, but you'll be relieved to discover that if the magpie looks you directly in the eye, it's a sign of respect and releases you from the customary salute. But even those of us who are less superstitious will often find ourselves looking for a second magpie, just to be on the safe side. Magpies will tend to eat flies, caterpillars, spiders and worms. But if you're putting out food to attract a range of birds to your garden, then these distinctive creatures will never be far away. They eat just about anything and will happily scavenge food from anywhere, along with your bird table offerings. Their strong bill has a sharp cutting edge which they use for digging up worms, picking fruit and for cutting flesh. Also, magpies have been known to take the eggs and nestlings of other birds, and they've been associated with the steady decline in songbird numbers, which does mean that they are far from being everybody's favourite bird. Despite their bad press, there's no denying that magpies are intelligent creatures and often fascinating to watch. If you want to discourage them from scaring away the smaller birds in your garden, make sure you don't put out more food than necessary, which will stop your offerings seeming quite so attractive. Another common bird you may well see in your garden is the beautiful blackbird. The male lives up to his name with a fantastic glossy black plumage and bright orange-yellow beak, whilst the female blackbird is often brown with spots and streaks on her breast. She can often be confused with the thrush or starling, and you'll need to look closely to be sure for identification purposes. Actually, not all blackbirds are completely black. Some have a few white patches, and although rare, you do get albino blackbirds that are completely white. Male blackbirds are known to establish a territory during their first year and tend to stay there their whole lives long. So, making sure your garden is welcoming to this wonderful species will attract them again and again. This fascinating bird is a delight to have in your garden, and as well as their lively personalities, you'll certainly know there's a blackbird about if any intruder comes onto the territory, whether that be a passing human or next door's cat. A blackbird's harsh chuk-chuk call is unmistakable, and a warning that'll alert all the other birds in your garden to danger as well. Blackbirds are usually seen in the morning or near dusk, often with their heads to the ground. Some people say that they're listening out for worms, but in fact they have to tilt their head to one side because of the position of their eyes. Another frequent visitor to British gardens with a distinctive call is the collared dove, which is very similar to the turtle dove, and on occasion can be mistaken for a pigeon. Nevertheless, this common bird has a very distinctive buff-pink plumage and black neck collar. Despite the fact that doves share certain features with the pigeon, such as small rounded heads and bodies, they have their own very unique characteristics. To many of us, doves, especially white and turtle doves, represent peace and love and have long been admired for this association. They are also seen as a symbol of deliverance and reconciliation, which dates back to the Bible and the Old Testament story of Noah's Ark, when Noah released a dove to seek out dry land. When the dove came back carrying an olive branch in its beak, Noah knew that the flood was over and the world was saved. Collared doves will usually be seen singularly or in pairs, and of course the familiar sound of their gentle cooing is very recognisable. Seeds will always be a welcome offering to encourage these lovely birds, and they'll be equally happy feeding on the ground or from bird tables. Now you may be thinking that the most attractive birds are bound to be the rarest, but taking a look at the lovely chaffinch, it's quite evident that some of our most frequent garden visitors are equally as beautiful as their more elusive counterparts. The male chaffinch has the most colourfully patterned plumage, made up of a rich chestnut back, vibrant pink breast and a blue-grey crown and nape. This bird can quite easily be mistaken for the bullfinch, a much less common species, which has now been given the endangered red status of the RSPB. During the winter months, the distinctive feathers of the chaffinch are not so bright, and the grey-blue bill turns yellowish, and the male will look very similar to the female. A female chaffinch is much duller than her mate, with an olive-brown back and grey-brown underparts all year round. But in the spring and summer, you'll certainly enjoy seeing the bright colours of the chaffinch, and you'll also spot a flash of white on the wings and under the tail when this bird is in flight. And do listen out for the chaffinch with its wonderful song. In fact, you may well hear this bird before you actually see it. A basic scattering of breadcrumbs and seeds at ground level or on low-level platforms such as a tree stump will prove very popular with the chaffinch, as well as other smaller species like the easy-to-recognise cheeky and lovable house sparrow. If you're feeding breadcrumbs, do remember that brown whole grain varieties are far more nutritious, and as you get more used to feeding the birds, seed mixes and more specialist high-calorie foods will be a much more valuable contribution to their diet, especially during the winter months.
Next, we'll move on to look at other delightful members of the finch family, beginning with the lovely green finch, a popular and sociable garden visitor. These birds will tend to squabble noisily, but only amongst themselves, making them fascinating to watch at bird tables or feeding stations. Green finches will feed at ground level, or from bird tables, and hanging feeders will always be very popular, especially when they are full of black sunflower seeds. The green finch is, as you would expect, predominantly green, sporting a yellow flash on its wings, and apart from harvest time in the autumn, when they tend to flock to the countryside in search of fruit and berries, you'll see them all year round. In winter, they'll certainly appreciate your food offerings, which will enable them to keep warm however cold it might become. With this species, though, there can be some confusion over identification with another member of the finch family, namely the siskin, which does look quite similar. Becoming familiar with the bird families as well as the individual species will be a very useful skill to build upon and develop, making it easier to make accurate identifications. But sometimes, as in this instance, you really do need to know what to look out for. The siskin is in fact smaller than the greenfinch and has a streaky yellow-green body with a black crown and bib. But the real giveaway that it's a siskin you're looking at is the fact that it feeds upside down with its head pointing towards the ground, something the greenfinch doesn't do. It's vital to remember that the location and position of bird feeders will be a very important factor when attracting the widest possible variety of everyday British birds to your garden. Get it right and they'll soon feel secure and trust your garden, which will make them come back time and time again. But do be patient, because on average it'll take birds at least a week to get used to new feeders. You may have to try putting food out in different places to have the maximum effect. Placing the feeders and food at different levels around the garden will attract a real diversity of birds, from the tiniest wren to the biggest crow. But you do need to make sure that this will not put the birds in any danger, particularly if you have a cat or there are a lot in the immediate vicinity. Also, you do need to make sure that you avoid attracting unwelcome guests. Squirrels may be delightful to look at,
But once you start buying specialist bird food, you'll soon realise that a squirrel raid can cost you a fortune, and worse still, overfeeding in your garden can encourage rats, which will make you very unpopular with the neighbours. And it's not only where you put out the food that needs considering. If you've a good supply of seed mixes, nuts and suet balls, you need to be careful where you keep them. When storing all these treats for the birds, you need to make sure mice, rats and squirrels can't get to them. And for maximum shelf life, it should ideally be a cool, dry place. Using dustbins or containers is a great way to prolong the life of bird food. And although what you see here is on quite a large scale, plastic containers on a shelf in a kitchen cupboard would be fine while you're getting started. Now, having gone to so much effort to keep your food supplies fresh, the next thing to be certain of is a routine to keep your bird table and feeders clean and hygienic. This will help your bird visitors stay happy and healthy. Finches in particular are prone to developing a particularly unpleasant parasite which blocks their throats and makes them unable to swallow, but a regular regime will help to prevent this. Also, reputable pet shops and food suppliers sell cleaning products that'll not harm the birds. You can see for yourself just how popular these well-kept feeders are, and this goldfinch is certainly enjoying a wonderful feast. Of all the finches, this is without doubt the most colourful, with both the male and female having equally bright face markings and beautiful black and gold wings. In the wild, the goldfinch will feed on weed seeds, including thistle, dandelion and knapweed, but adding black sunflower seeds to a garden bird table will certainly help to attract this bird. During the winter, many goldfinches will migrate to southern Europe, but some will remain all year round, so it's always worth looking out for them. As well as a variety of finches, your fast-developing bird garden is bound to attract members of the tit family, with all species being absolutely delightful. It's interesting to note that the word tit comes from an old Germanic word for small, and is used in various European languages, referring to diminutive objects, people or animals. Nevertheless, despite the appropriateness of the name, these little birds can really make their presence felt. Cheeky and boisterous, most members of the tit family are very acrobatic and energetic, which is why they're always so fascinating to watch. The most well-known of them all is the blue tit, with its colourful mix of blue, yellow, white and green plumage. If you're getting a lot of blue tits coming to feed in your garden, you'll know that you're doing well, as they spend most of their time amongst the tree branches by preference. The Great Tit is the biggest member of this family group, measuring about 14 centimetres in length, and with its green and yellow plumage and striking glossy black head with white cheeks, it's another very attractive bird. However, far from being timid, this tit can be quite aggressive at the bird table, especially with fellow great tits. In the winter months, though, this species will team up with other small birds like the blue tit to form mixed flocks, applying the principle of safety in numbers. This makes it easier for them to spot predators, such as magpies and sparrowhawks. And if you have a ready supply of suet balls and seed mixes, there'll be plenty of food for them to share once they've established a suitable pecking order. In fact, you can make your own fat-rich foods which will help to keep the smaller birds in your garden happy through the winter months. And here's a basic recipe for a bird cake that you can adapt to what suits your particular garden best. First, melt chopped suet either over a low heat in a saucepan or in the microwave. Next, mix together some ingredients of your choosing. A good combination to start with would be 3/4 cup of fine whole wheat dry breadcrumbs, half a cup of shelled sunflower seeds, and 1/4 cup of dried fruit. Take the suet off the heat and allow it to cool and thicken slightly before mixing it in with the rest of the ingredients. Your bird cake is now complete, and you can either set it in packs to put in the feeders or smear it around your garden on tree trunks and branches. If you don't want to make your own, then buying suet and fat balls ready prepared will be equally as good. When buying fat balls, however, do remember that they tend to arrive in mesh, which the birds can get tangled up in. So simply cut away the mesh and put a few fat balls in a feeder before hanging it out in a good location. Make sure you've got a good view though, because this really will generate a lot of bird activity. Our next species is the Gold Tit, and although it's not as colourful as some of the other tits, it's just as fascinating to watch with its distinctive grey back and black cap, complete with a white patch at the back of its neck. This bird is very similar to the willow and marsh tit, so make sure you keep this in mind when bird watching, as it is one of the trickier tits to identify correctly. The Gold Tit often stores plentiful food away for leaner times, hiding seeds and nuts in flower beds or clumps of moss. But unfortunately, they have a poor memory and can't always recall where these treats are buried. Great Tits can be rather cheeky, as they will watch what's going on and then raid these stores as soon as the Gold Tit flies off. Our next species, the robin, does tend to be associated with Christmas, despite the fact that you're likely to see this beautiful bird all year round. The reason for the robin's seasonal associations actually date back to the mid-19th century, when they became very popular images on Christmas cards. The first Christmas cards appeared when a publisher by the name of Henry Cole decided this was a better idea than writing lots of individual Christmas letters, but this didn't catch on immediately. It was only when the penny post was introduced a short while later, followed by a half rate for cards, that this tradition became really popular. And of course, the postmen delivering the cards were a welcome sight, and in their red jackets they were nicknamed robins. This is why robins became synonymous with Christmas, and the charming little bird was a perfect image to put on the cards that they carried. Popular legend also has it that there was a robin, minus the red breast, at the Nativity in the stable when Jesus was born. When there was no more firewood, Joseph left Mary and the baby to look for some, but while he was gone, the fire started to dim and go out. The story goes that the robin flapped its wings over the flames to keep them alight, and in so doing scorched its breast, which has been red ever since. Charming as these stories are, the robin is indeed distinctive with its bright red breast and brown plumage. They are small birds with a body length of around 14 centimetres, and both the male and female look identical, but juvenile robins will have a spotted brown plumage before they go on to develop the colourful red breast. One of the robins' favourite meals will be worms, and they'll often watch gardeners digging up the fresh soil so that they are poised to swoop on any tasty treats brought to the surface. It may come as a surprise, but you can actually buy live foods to attract more birds to your garden. In fact, if you find that live foods work for you, it's possible to breed your own if you want to keep your costs down. Mealworms are extremely popular, with robins in particular, and are very easy to maintain, so long as everyone in your household knows what to expect if they take the lid off the box. Mealworms are the larva form of the Tenebrio molitor beetle and are usually around 2 centimetres long. They're high in protein and a great food source, especially for your garden birds during the nesting season. The breeding of mealworms can be done in any container with a lid, from an old biscuit tin to a plastic lunchbox, just so long as you provide holes for ventilation. Put in the mealworms with a food source. Bran or oatmeal is often used, and you can even buy specially prepared mealworm food, and it's literally as easy as that, because the life cycle is totally self-perpetuating. Other live foods to consider as an alternative would be crickets, waxworms and earthworms, but if you don't like the thought of anything that wriggles, you can get dried mealworms, which can be particularly good, mixed into the bird cake recipe we looked at earlier. Before we leave the robin, it's worth mentioning nesting, something that you really want to encourage in your garden if you possibly can. Robins will become quickly confident once they realise that they are safe, and of all the species of everyday garden birds, are the most comfortable around humans. Putting food closer and closer to your house may even have the cheeky robin venturing indoors looking for tasty treats. They'll nest in all sorts of strange places, ranging from a drain pipe to an old watering can, so be on the lookout during the spring and summer. The robin's nest is made from grass, moss and dead leaves, lined with hair and wool, where the female incubates her eggs for up to 2 weeks before they hatch. Even though robins have a charming nature, when it comes to their territory when they're nesting, they can become rather aggressive, puffing out their red breast to warn other birds that might get too close to their babies. Interestingly, this 18th century children's nursery rhyme was written about robins and how they'll defend their territories to the death. "Who killed Cock Robin? I," said the sparrow, "with my bow and arrow, I killed Cock Robin." But it isn't only robins that'll nest in your garden. Other birds will too, and many bird-watching enthusiasts will put up nesting boxes. This is something that can be kept up all year round, as it'll be a great place for bringing up a family in the spring and summer, but will also provide shelter for the birds in the colder autumn and winter months. The species you'll attract will depend on the size of the box and the entrance hole, but always make sure you put it out of reach of cats in a quiet place in the garden, high up in a tree, or even on a suitable wall or fence. Just as was the case with the feeders, it's important to keep the bird boxes hygienic, so once the fledglings have flown, you can give it a good clean out. Do make sure, though, that there are no eggs left in the nest box, and there are a few rules that apply here. The Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1981 says you cannot legally move unhatched eggs between the months of February to September. After October, any unhatched eggs should be taken and destroyed, because by then you can be absolutely certain that they've been abandoned. One of the nicest things about garden bird watching is the fact that when you've established a garden that the birds will enjoy, they'll return year in, year out. Particularly during the autumn, you'll find many birds head to the countryside, but they'll soon return if you keep putting food out, and some will come back to the same nesting boxes annually, which is indeed a compliment to the bird-friendly garden you've created. You'll be surprised how quickly you start to spot slightly more unusual species, and this lovely bird is a prime example. The nuthatch is sometimes confused with the blue tit because of the blue colouring in its plumage, but it's actually quite different when you look a little more closely. The nuthatch is more like a miniature version of a woodpecker and has rather an unusual talent for walking down a tree trunk head first. This will, of course, identify the nuthatch immediately, but it also has colourful blue-grey wings, pinkish-brown underparts, and a distinctive black facial stripe that looks like a robber's mask. The name comes from the skill this bird has for splitting open nuts and acorns by wedging them into suitable crevices and hammering them with its strong black bill. This is a resident tree-creeping species that is fairly widespread throughout central and southern Britain, wherever there is woodland or mature trees flourish. If the nuthatch seems quite tricky to spot, it isn't because they're particularly rare, it's just that they're rather sedentary, hardly ever moving more than a few miles from the area of their birth. The nuthatch we've been watching certainly appears to be very partial to this lovely bird bath, and this is a vital piece of equipment, attracting all manner of species, giving them a safe place to drink and bathe. It needs to be shallow with sloping sides, making it accessible to all sorts of bird species, as well as being in a good location in the garden. Birds get rather preoccupied when bathing and are more vulnerable as they are unable to keep such a sharp lookout for predators. Consequently, choosing a location where the birds have clear visibility all around, as well as bushes close by for a speedy escape, will bring you lots of visitors. When natural water resources are dwindling or freeze during the winter, there's nothing better than a fresh, clean bird bath to keep the birds healthy and active. Just as with everything else we've looked at for the birds in this programme, it's important to keep your bird bath clean and constantly topped up. So far, we've confined ourselves to looking at everyday British birds in the garden. But as our programme draws to a close, we'll take a brief look at some of our best-loved British birds that can be found just beyond the garden gate, on our rivers, lakes and ponds. The species that we're watching out for are of course ducks, and are often many people's first experience of birdwatching as small children. Taking stale bread to feed the ducks is always entertaining, and if you remember to take your birdwatcher's diary with you as well, you'll be able to jot down notes in case you want to make sure you've identified the species you've seen correctly later. Wherever you go around the British Isles in search of water, you're sure to find the mallard. This is a large duck with a long body and broad bill, and is the most widespread of species, making it home in any suitable wetland habitat. The male is the easier of the two sexes to spot, with its vividly coloured dark green head and a yellow bill, with a purple-brown breast and shimmering grey body. Despite this being a very common duck, the vibrancy of the mallard's plumage makes it exquisite, although the female is as unexceptional as the male is sensational, being mainly brown with an orange bill. Now, wherever there are mallards, chances are there will be coots and moorhens close by. Both species are an absolute delight, and you'll be happy to watch their antics for hours. But if you're wondering how to tell them apart, it's actually surprisingly easy, provided you remember which is which. Coots are completely black, apart from their very distinctive white beak and shield. They are short-tailed birds with sturdy legs and feet that are lobed, as well as having flaps of skin on their toes, which act rather like webbed feet when swimming. This fascinating bird is more than happy to dive below the surface to depths in excess of 2 meters when searching for food, such as insect larvae or small aquatic creatures. The coot is generally a sociable creature, but it'll become quite aggressive towards other birds during the breeding season in disputes over territory. The same is true of the moorhen, which has an olive-brown back and head with blue-grey underparts. Both male and female look the same, and the most distinctive feature is their red bill with a yellow tip. If you're still in doubt, as this duck swims away or dives down to the depths, you'll always see a flash of white under its tail feathers. During the breeding season, moorhens will become very protective over their young, and interestingly, both parents will incubate around 8 eggs between them in any brood. When the first 2 or 3 moorhen chicks have hatched, they'll stick very closely to one of the parents, while the other parent sits and waits for the remaining chicks to hatch. Just like the mallard, moorhens and coots can be found just about anywhere there is water, and no doubt they'll be resident at your local park. This next species of waterbird may well visit your garden if you happen to have a well-stocked fish pond, which may not be the best news. But out in the countryside, the grey heron is one of the most beautiful birds you could ever wish to see. The grey heron is the largest European heron, standing 90 to 100 centimetres tall, and with its neck stretched out while looking for food, or hunched down with its neck bent over its chest, it'll keep incredibly still. With a plumage of grey and off-white, with a pinkish yellow bill, you may wonder if it's a statue you're looking at. But when it lunges for fish or takes off in flight, you'll be left in no doubt that it's very much alive. As your interest in birds develops, there are so many places for you to visit, and with RSPB bird sanctuaries and wildfowl and wetland trusts all around Great Britain, the number of species you'll get to see will just continue to rise. But after watching this programme, you'll now have plenty of ideas for turning your own garden into a haven for the birds.
Choosing a suitable bird table will help you to really experiment with the kinds of food you put out for the birds. And of course, you'll get a much better view of what's going on than if you simply scattered your offerings along the ground. Feeders will also be a great addition to your garden, with black sunflower and Niger seeds being the best attractors for the various finches and tits we've been looking at, encouraging them to come back to visit again and again. Putting up nest boxes is another way to ensure you have plenty of birds to watch, and the investment of your time and effort to do this will be well rewarded over the years to come. Another very good way to encourage a wide variety of bird species to your garden, if you have the space, is to create a wildlife pond. In effect, what you'll be doing is increasing the insect population, and this in turn will most definitely attract the birds. As with the bird bath, sloping sides are a very good idea, and where the water is deeper, putting in rocks and floating plants will give the birds somewhere to land safely. Also, you do need to make sure that your pond will get plenty of direct sunlight during the day to be certain that your aquatic plants will flourish. And last but not least, if you want your pond specifically to cater for the needs of your birds, it's probably better to take a miss on the fish, as they will eat the precious insects that you've worked so hard to provide. If this all seems quite a lot of effort, do remember that this will be the start of a wonderful way to pass the time. And as lovely as the blackbirds, robins and greenfinches undoubtedly are, there are a great many more species for you to look out for. And if you want to know what pleasures await you, then the next programme in this series, Birds to Treasure, will be all the motivation you need. With woodpeckers, jays and long-tailed tits, your knowledge of birds will quickly advance as your notebook fills up with fascinating sightings. There are also plenty of migrant visitors to consider, including the cuckoo in spring and the balmy summer swallows and house martins. In fact, the possibilities are endless, and you can be sure that when you start spotting new species in your bird-friendly garden, there'll be plenty more to follow. So, with the help of everyday garden birds, you're now ready to embark upon a journey of discovery that really will provide you with a lifetime of relaxation and absolute delight.